In support of International Women's Day, we have Claire Hackett today joining us to talk about women in private equity. Hello, Claire. Welcome.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
Claire, we've worked together for many years. I'm very thankful that you've come in today to talk to us about women in private equity. But your career started in retail, and then you novated into consulting.
Just like a contract.
And then into private equity. I have to drop the jargon.
Good.
It'd be great to hear from you your career journey, from when you started through to the fund now where you work.
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually studied finance and marketing. And once I realized that I didn't want to work in investment banking, didn't want to work in finance, I went to study. I did an intensive Chinese course in China, and just so happened to start working at a retail company, a French fashion brand called Etam in Shanghai. And that was the start of my career, working in the CEO office for that brand. Then moved into consulting in London, working at a company called A&M. And then, of course, with yours truly, moved over to Kearney a few years ago. And recently left Kearney to work at SVP in the private equity ops team.
What Claire didn't mention was we worked together at A&M and then Kearney.
That is true.
But now we've separated, but still keep working together in a different context. In terms of, it'd be good to explore in terms of the challenges that you experienced on that journey, particularly just from a gender perspective.
When I get asked this question, I always say that I haven't really experienced any, challenges. But in hindsight's 2020, like I always like to say, you notice different things, through the years about how comfortable you felt or about how sure of yourself you felt. And I think that's probably the challenges. Those are probably the challenges that I had, in addition to obviously in consulting, challenges that both males and females have. It being a really competitive environment and with long hours, etc. But yeah, on the flip side, the positive of that journey was that nobody ever said no. Everybody has always been super supportive, yourself included.
Great to hear.
Level of sponsorship. If you asked for money to do an event, if you asked for money for a software, if you asked for exposure to a client. I don't think it was rare that people said no along the way.
That's great to hear.
So both challenging and empowering.
Yeah, especially it's good to hear that there are elements that you felt empowering on the journey.
Yeah.
How have you cultivated your leadership style as a female? And particularly interesting would be to hear the different styles you adopted between consulting and private equity.
Interesting. Yeah, I would say my leadership style, has changed over time, based on the environment that I've been in, it being, different corporate environments, the leaders and mentors that I've learned from, the regions that I've worked in, starting out my career in China, and, how those cultures impact the working environment. And I'd say, over time based on those cultures, based on the leaders that I've worked with, kind of created this ever-changing mosaic, which is my leadership style. But like an example is in, starting out in China, the style is a lot more directive, it's a lot more prescriptive. Based on language barriers as well, you might speak in a different way. And then moving to the UK, and even though my dad's British, having this kind of like culture shock where it's a lot more, and also consulting, a lot more asking questions. But yeah, it's changed over time depending on the different people I've interacted with.
That's an interesting point. I've also grown up in different parts of the world, and what I heard from you there was that culture and region also has a play in how you form your leadership style as a female, and you've pivoted subject to where you've been.
Yeah, no, for sure. When I started my career, in China, I thought that was the way that people operated in the working environment. And then I moved to consulting, and I remember one manager, his name was James, that I had, He was great. And he asked, Claire, would you like to potentially do this? And I was like, James, you're my boss. Just tell me what to do. So it was like, it was a shock for me to go from one culture to another and then learn to also, express things in a more question-like style through consulting in the English culture.
As you know, it's a hot topic at Kearney, and we've explored particular challenges that some of our female colleagues encounter. So I'd be interested to hear from you whether you've experienced any of these challenges. Some of the challenges we've identified are things like mini-me, where you almost have to adopt a male persona to succeed, or burden, where there are certain roles that are historically been given to females on a team, and cold spots, where, in other words, because of the very male-dominated society that one can find oneself in, men talk in a certain way, and so females don't feel very included. Have you come across any of these three in your experience?
Probably all three, but in the moment I didn't know. So in hindsight, I realized. An example with the mini-me thing is that I didn't have any female mentors that I was building this mosaic based off of. And so I would look to females around, maybe in different practices in consulting, or formal mentors like I had here at Kearney, to see what I was allowed to do. Like, am I allowed to not wear black and white only, but wear super colorful colors to work? Am I allowed to cross my legs when I sit at the desk? Answer is yes. Am I allowed to be smiley and be peppy and be my own person in the in my full self? And I think that I wasn't my full self at the beginning, not because of anybody's fault, but I didn't realize how having male mentors impacted me in that way.
No, very clear. And hopefully, as the balance corrects, future female leaders will not have that same situation, but there'll be a better balance, and so less of the cold spots and burden. So in a way, you've been a trailblazer.
Let's put it that way, yeah.
In terms of your career, and particularly in consulting, I'd be very interested to hear from you what you consider to be good leadership from a female leader.
Ooh, that's a hard one.
Maybe it's a bit unfair.
Well, I'd say good leadership doesn't change based on whether you're a female leader or whether you're a male leader.
Yeah.
There's many different leadership styles, right? And both can be on a man and on a woman, and they both work in many different situations. So I think it would be unfair to say, a woman can't be, direct or prescriptive, and a man can't be, soft or emotionally intelligent. I think that's maybe a little bit unfair. Yeah.
I'd agree. Yeah. So Claire, tell me, what would your top pieces of advice be to junior females looking for a career path in consulting, particularly then in consulting to private equity and then in private equity, based on your experience?
My advice is for all women in the working environment, I think, maybe more so in consulting and private equity. I haven't really thought about how it translates to different industries, but intentionality, I think, is what I'd say, and that kind of boils down to two things. Intentional isn't always asking for what you want. You don't get what you want if you don't ask, right? And you never know what the other person's thinking if you don't ask. And sometimes people will say no, and that's fine. But to always ask.
Yep.
And the second one is to intentionally find people who will sponsor you and who can give you clarity. So if you ever have, a moment of doubt, somebody to talk to that can kind of dispel that away. Dispel any insecurities or any ambiguity.
I think a lot of what you've just said actually is what I looked for as a male.
Yeah.
So some similarities there. Just pivoting a little bit to where you are now. in a private equity fund, some questions around that. What do you think are the must-haves that private equity should do from a diversity perspective? And particularly, what in your point of view do women bring to the investment community?
So from a diversity standpoint, obviously gender equity, gender balance is has a big impact. But diversity is obviously not only that. It's a lot of other things, different cultures, different backgrounds, and that's not just, where you come from, but also where you've worked before, because that brings a lot of different perspectives along the way. And that's important in all working environments, obviously. And then in the private equity environment or in the investor environment, it's also really important because you have formal things like investment committees, ICs, and obviously having different perspectives in that is going to have a better outcome on your decisions. So it's really important in those contexts too.
Fully agree. In terms of the grade structure or the seniority in private equity, many reports are now suggesting that at more junior levels, there is parity between male and female colleagues. However, it indicates that there's still quite a way to go at the more senior levels, sort of at the managing director level. What do you think is the key thing for private equity to do to start driving a balance more at the senior levels? And how practically should they go about it?
Good question. I think it's quite similar to everything we spoke about as well when I was here at Kearney. I remember there being a project about the recruitment process, retention, etc. And I read something that said in private equity, similar to what you just said, in private equity, the intake is about 50-50, male, female. But then once it gets to the kind of MD level, the senior levels, it's only about 15% male, 85 female. And another thing that I read, which is probably part of the problem, is that males get promoted 1.5 times faster than females, which is obviously part of the, if you're a female and you feel like you're being left behind, then you wouldn't stay, right? So I think, promotion process, and then also policies, maternity policies, everything that, will help retain talent before the senior levels, I think is the answer there.
I agree. So it's addressing some of the systemic policies, procedures, differences between paternity, mat leave, that kind of thing. But it feels like there's some critical areas to address burden or cold spots in terms of how women or how men and women talk to each other.
I don't know yet, right? I'm new to the industry, but yeah.
So let's pivot a little bit towards the broader topic of ESG, environmental, social, and governance. We've seen certainly a trend amongst private equity funds to have somebody that's head of ESG. But we also have seen more of a requirement on us consultants to incorporate ESG into all of the work that we do. Is that something that you're also observing in private equity?
I remember, when we were working together, ESG and ODDs, the ESG DDs and ODDs going together a lot, ESG DDs, CDDs going together a lot, right? That was a thing that was happening more and more frequently, and it was becoming more and more important. And then now being on the buy side, I see all the mechanics of that, right? And how important it is and how much of a focus there is on it. And, I think there are some firms, maybe smaller firms that don't have dedicated resource that might just, have ESG reporting or be doing ESG from a risk mitigation kind of standpoint. Like, is this going to impact our reputation or something like
exactly.
that? Right, yeah. And that's slowly moving, I'd say quickly moving actually, because of the pressure from the LPs to the GPs and so forth. But that's moving towards more of a value creation perspective where ESG is not just a reporting mechanism, it's not just, an acronym on a page, but it runs through the whole value creation program. What was your question?
And what do you think? No, I've seen exactly the same. So, ESG used to be very regulatory. What is the risk of a ESG event? But now I feel that private equity is taking a lead in driving ESG for the better of society. Do you feel that as well? Do you see that as well?
I do, because I think it has a lot of leverage, right? If you think of like the funnel of LPs, and before that what their mandate is, right? And these LPs are big institutional investors, requiring certain things of their investments or their GPs, and then their GPs also requiring certain things of their portfolio companies. So suddenly you've got one LP impacting multiple GPs that are impacting a lot of portfolio companies that are impacting a lot of lives. So it definitely has a lot of leverage in the way that the whole industry operates. Fun fact. I read that back in 2008, institutional investors, like less than 5% of institutional investors, were asking for DEI statistics when they were going through their fundraising. When GPs were going through their fundraising, and now it's about 55%. So that's a huge, huge, huge increase. And if that's something that they're asking about in the fundraising process, it's suddenly got more of a focus for GPs, and then also for the portfolio companies.
I've been in this game for 23 years, and I must say 23 years ago DE&I wasn't an acronym that I'd heard of, but certainly I've seen a significant change. Are there any specific areas that you think where private equity funds, clearly they have 50, 100, 150 portfolio companies, how they can take a more active stance on driving gender balance in their portfolios? So you're an operational excellence team member in your fund. What would you take to your fund, to your portfolio firms, in terms of driving a greater gender balance?
I mean, I think first is transparency, right? And making sure that is getting tracked. And then doing the same for what, in consulting and private equity, is we're doing in our recruitment processes, having, an equitable slate, then making sure that people are meeting women along the process, or women are meeting women, then retention policies, et cetera, et cetera. It's no different. I think one thing that we have to be aware of, though, is there are other, macroeconomic factors and other societal factors. So, for example, if you have a portfolio company that is very male-dominated, it's not just that you can force it to become, female-dominated. There's different aspects at play, i.e. where they recruit from, how many women are going through university with that kind of degree that's bringing them to that industry.
I mean,
it's complicated.
I've heard the excuses. Oh, women don't work in this industry, right? Oh, it's the auto industry. But I'm sure there must be a way to weave into the strategic imperative of a management board that diversity matters and that there is better representation. I don't think the excuses of yesteryear apply anymore. Would you say the same?
Yeah, absolutely.
I look forward to seeing the successes that you drive in your current portfolio, Claire. Do you think PE firms have a solid mandate for driving this at the moment, or do you feel to drive greater gender balance, or do you feel that it's more of a passive approach to it?
I mean, from the experiences that I'm currently going through, I think it's very, very active. But I couldn't speak for others. When I was working with you in consulting, all of our private equity clients were very, very different, right? And so I think some firms have more pressure to do so. Some firms have more, within their actual investment mandate, they need to do more.
Like an impact fund.
Yeah, and that's an obvious, black and white version of that, right? And then And then, along the way, what are your investors wanting other than if you're just an impact fund? But what are the other LP pressures that requests that you have? And then also, what's the culture of your firm? What do you believe in?
So Claire, now that you're my boss, have you got any tips for me as a consultant and generally the consulting industry as to what we can learn from private equity from a gender balance perspective?
So I don't actually know the differences in the stats between consulting and private equity. When I was working in consulting, I felt like it was very female dominant. At least the firms that I worked with, especially Kearney, I never felt like I was part of a very masculine, a very male-dominated firm or anything like that. But I guess talking about that funnel that we were talking about earlier, with LPs and institutional investors being able to impact, GPs being able to impact the portfolio companies and impacting lots and lots of lives. I think consulting has an opportunity, has it as its disposal, a kind of funnel in itself, in that it touches so many different companies through consulting, and not just ESG consulting, but all different types of consulting that it can influence along the way, even when it's not the core problem at hand.
I'd agree. I mean, the funds that I work with have diverse teams, so why wouldn't I have diverse teams? And it brings a complete picture to any project. So thank you very much, Claire.
Yeah.
We're thanking Claire Hackett for today coming to talk to us about women in PE in support of International Women's Day. Thank you.